send the same number of members to the Senate? What arguments can you make for and against including the 3/5 clause and the fugitive slave clause in the Constitution? You may begin.
The Philadelphia Convention was an assembly of demigods. Jefferson's statements show that some of the greatest political minds in the world met in 1787 as 55 delegates to amend the Articles of Confederation. However, the result of the convention was the creation of the Constitution of the United States of America. The major conflicts at the convention were distribution of governmental powers between the states and the national government, legislative representation, and voter representation.
Under the Articles of Confederation, there was a near non-existent central government, and this is exemplified in Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation, which state that each state retains sovereignty, freedom, and independence. The fear of a strong central government rooted itself in experience under British rule, and the fear of a loss of state power to that of federal power. This anti-federalist fear also helped establish the Bill of Rights and a checked executive branch under the Constitution. However, some of the convention pushed for a stronger central government than what was established under the Articles of Confederation.
Shays' Rebellion helped this argument of the necessary stronger government when the national government was unable to help Massachusetts put down a farmer insurrection. As stated in Federalist No. 9 by Alexander Hamilton, a firm union will be of the utmost moment to the peace and liberty of the states, as a barrier against domestic faction and insurrection. Ultimately, within the Constitution, those in favor of a strong central government won the debate over state versus federal power, with establishment of such federal powers such as centralized military, centralized tax, regulation of interstate commerce, and the Supremacy Clause, establishing the Constitution as the higher law of the country.
The delegates at the convention argued over equal legislative representation in the developing federal government. If representation was based on population, as outlined in James Madison's Virginia plan, then states with more people would have an unfair amount of influence compared to states with fewer people. However, if representation went according to William Patterson's New Jersey plan, which was to continue the equal representation under the Articles of Confederation, the smaller population states would have more power because they'd have equal representation for fewer citizens. Additionally, Alexander Hamilton proposed the New York Plan, a system which included a bicameral legislature, an assembly and senate, executive governor with life-term judiciary, nationally appointed state governors, and national veto power over state legislation.
To appease all sides of the argument, the Great Compromise was formed. Its main points being that the House of Representatives is made up of proportional representation, and that the Senate is based on equal representation. The drawback to offering small states equal representation in the Senate is that it creates the possibility of an influential minority. An additional drawback is senators can vote individually, promoting their own personal interest and not necessarily that of the state. Equal representation in the Senate is ultimately acceptable and fair because it balances the House of Representatives, and that states can equally check the executive through approval of appointments and treaties.
The argument over slavery also created much tension at the Philadelphia Convention. The issue was whether or not slaves were considered property or humans. The southern states wanted to count slaves as people for more representation in the House, in Article 1, Section 2. The northern states felt that the South's desires weren't in conjunction with their views on slavery. Massachusetts delegate Elbridge Gerry pointed out that if slaves were considered property in the South, then his cattle and horses would be represented as well.
The result of this argument was a 3/5 slave clause, as proposed by James Wilson. The fugitive slave clause in Article 4, Section 2 was also established to please the South and impose regulations on escaped slaves. Although compromises were made on the issue of slavery, no definitive decision would be made until the post-Civil War era with the creation of the 13th Amendment.
Benjamin Franklin stated of the ratification of the Constitution that, "There are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve, but I am sure I shall never approve them. I doubt too whether any other Constitution we can obtain may be able to make a better Constitution." Issues such as slavery and representation brought upon heated debate, yet eventually ended in compromise where neither sides of the debate were satisfied. Because of the compromise, which was the underlying theme of the Philadelphia Convention, the Constitution was formed. Thank you.
Thank you. We have some cross-examination questions for you. I'll start off. The Philadelphia Convention was held in secret. Do you think that could be done today, and do you think that would be a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it absolutely would be really difficult to do today with the prevalence of social media and such instantaneous communication that we see in texting and just the internet in general. Information would undoubtedly leak out from the convention and get to people.
And it would be a benefit because outside influences would not sway people's decisions when creating such an important document, such as the Constitution. And this would ultimately create a more objective form of government rather than something that is biased.
This would be very difficult today. An example of this was seen in the presidential campaign in this November, in which Governor Romney was in a closed dinner for high donors of his campaign, and he made a comment about 47% of Americans don't kind of live off the government, and he never thought that would get out to the public. Ultimately it did, and ended up hurting his campaign.
I'm going to take it a different way here. In your opinion, what was more important to the framers in protecting individual rights? Was it the Bill of Rights, or was it the concept of representation?
I think it was the Bill of Rights because they wanted to protect individual rights, and under British rule, many of their individual rights were not protected. For example, slaves could come into their house, not slaves, soldiers could come into their house without a warrant and search their house and possibly persecute them and take them over to England and imprison them for no reason. So they wanted to protect their rights so they could not experience this again.
I think the issue of representation in regards to natural people's rights was far more represented at the convention because there were provisions within the Constitution made for the establishment of the Senate and the House of Representatives, whereas the Bill of Rights did not come up until ratification debates after the convention was already finished.
I would argue that representation is more important than the rights at the convention. Well, also because the Bill of Rights wasn't ratified until after the convention, but because of the Great Compromise that was formed at the convention, and that two plans were created to create the Great Compromise: the New Jersey Plan under James Wilson and the Virginia Plan under James Madison. And I think it created much heated debate on whether or not states should have more say or should the people have more say. And I think the Great Compromise was the way of balancing the two.
Is it accurate and legitimate to call our system of government a limited government when you have a general welfare clause and a necessary and proper clause?
I think the term limited government is still applicable because under the necessary and proper clause, that is clause 18, and it has to be enacted as an addition to one of the previous 17 clauses, that you can't just do anything just because. It has to go along with something that's already provided for.
An example of this is the recent Affordable Care Act, which they deemed necessary and proper, but they ultimately let the states decide whether or not to enact it, so this is how they're limiting the federal power.
It would be difficult to say that this is limited government because under Brutus's first paper in 1787, he said that the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause really created a lot of troubles because Congress has so much power to enact what they want. And in the Anti-Federalist paper, in Federalist Paper 69, Hamilton laid out a plan for an energetic executive, which also makes the government seem even more involved and more active.
What responsibilities, if any, do citizens have for seeing that individual rights are protected and the common good is promoted?
Individuals have a responsibility to primarily be aware of their rights. It's hard to protect individual rights and promote the common good if an individual doesn't even know what their rights are.
And to do this, you can go back to the classical Republican idea of educating your citizens, and if you educate your citizens, they ultimately know what their rights are, and they can protect their rights under the government they're in.
Citizens can protect their rights by petitioning the government and also proposing amendments through their state legislatures to eventually change the Constitution if they deem that it does not protect their individual rights.
Court cases are also very important to promote the common good, such as Miranda versus Arizona, when Miranda was primarily looking out for his own interests, but in the end he set a precedent that helped future criminals and accused.
One of the concepts that came up as a result of the Philadelphia Convention was Thomas Jefferson's idea that the Constitution should be rewritten by every generation. Do you think we should be holding a constitutional convention now to update 200-plus-year-old document? Why or why not?
I do not think that it should be rewritten because of our recent gridlock in Congress. Over the fiscal cliff debate, a lot of stuff is not happening, and therefore, if they had to create a whole new constitution every however many years, this would never be possible because of the partisan gridlock.
Additionally, it's not absolutely necessary to rewrite an entire constitution, as Article 5 has provisions for the amendment process, and as Lila just mentioned, the judicial review power that the Supreme Court has also allows for them to decide cases that set precedents that will also allow citizens to change the government path.
Thank you. We'll go in reverse order with comments. We'll step down there and turn this one.
Well, good. Mason, I like your comment about the Romney, bringing it in kind of a contemporary scope, and I appreciate that. Austin, you mentioned Republicans. I'm not sure if that was big R or small r, so I caught that. But I really appreciate all your guys' eye contact in your delivery, so thank you for that.
Yeah, I would agree. I thought you all were relaxed and your pace was slow, and so we were able to follow you. Mason, I think you stood out just in that you were good about using some current examples like Obamacare, fiscal cliff. I thought you all were very comfortable and knowledgeable and able to give very comprehensive responses. So you did a good job with that. So nice work.
Couple of things. Anna, you said I think when you gave your answers a couple of times. You're giving your answer. That is what you think. Don't tell us that. You can start right out with the answer. I think as a crutch, try and get away from that. I thought that the use of all of the members of the group was really good. And Lila, you used some excellent evidence. There was great references that you had, and you had them. Federalist 69, you knew what it was, you knew who said it. That's impressive, and that's the kind of stuff that people are looking for. I also thought that your scope when you answered questions was great. We talked about the legislature, we talked about the Senate, we talked about the judiciary. You guys did a great job with all of that. And you worked together very nicely, picking up on the points that the other part of the group made. Finally, just one thing. When you're asked about whether if you are asked about whether you should rewrite the Constitution, Constitution's a living document. It rewrites itself all the time because we are looking at the way that we now view the Constitution and what it meant. So those words, living document, will mean something to judges if you say it.
I thought you did a real good job. Lila, you need to speak up, and I guess I'll disagree with one of my colleagues. Is you need to slow down. It was all like one-word sentences, is what it sounded like. And I know you guys are trying to get in there into the 4 minutes. If you're having trouble getting in there into the 4 minutes, this is the time to cut out a sentence somewhere and give yourselves a little breathing room, because it's not going to be easier on Saturday. And remember, you're going to be a room that seats 200 people, so if you don't speak up, there are no microphones. So if you don't speak up, no one's going to hear you. Good examples. I will point out to you that the 13th Amendment was actually passed before the end of the Civil War. That was the whole idea of the 13th Amendment. So it was not a post-Civil War era amendment. So be careful about that. Other than that, very good examples. I thought that there was some real good thought in there, but what I really liked was that you did act as a team. You listened to each other, which meant that you could build off of each other. The only criticism I would have is be real careful if you're like the third or fourth person speaking. If you're not really adding something to the conversation, you're just repeating something either from your testimony or something else, don't bother doing it, because then you'll have more time to do another question. Because the more questions you can get through, the more knowledge you get to show off. But good job. Thank you.